Very interesting and probably distracting day, so we really appreciate you being with us. My name is Amanda Horner. I am the Safety and Mobility Planner with the Mid-America Regional Council. And again, we want to welcome you to the Pathways to Vision Zero Summit. We're excited to be hosting this summit in an effort to encourage our community to reduce traffic crash fatalities and serious injuries to zero. For this session, we encourage you to turn your cameras on so that our guest speakers feel they are interacting with you, but please keep your mics off during the presentation. We invite you to type any questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and I got muted, in the Q&A time at the end. Also, for those, some of you already have, but if you haven't seen it yet, please in the chat post what comes to mind when you think about the intersection of equity and Vision Zero. So we want to thank our Planning Summit partners represented here on this. So thank you to all of those organizations that help make this series possible. Real quick, before we get into the session, we want to invite area jurisdictions to take lessons learned from the Pathways to Vision Zero Summit and put them into action for your community. Mark will be hosting a two-part workshop with subject matter experts designed to help you bring a policy and initial plan to make streets safe for everyone. Save the dates of December 4th and 8th, and registration will be open soon for that. So we are very excited to host this next session titled A Case for Equity. Our speakers today are Jeffrey Williams and Phil Doherty. Jeffrey Williams has been a director of city planning and development for Kansas City, Missouri since March 2015. He leads a 130-member staff that guides the physical development of Kansas City, which covers 319 square miles and has a population of over 480,000 people. The department handles two functions: planning services, managing development policy, conducting research, and crafting the long-term vision of the city and administering the city's zoning and land use approval boards, along with development services, reviewing plans, issuing permits, and code enforcement. Jeffrey is originally from Yonkers, New York, and served as the president of Yonkers Historical Society and Yonkers Advisory Council for Career and Technical Education chairperson. He became advisory board member for the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Department of Agriculture, Architecture, Urban Planning, and Design in 2016. We're going on a little sleep today, guys. We also have Phil Doherty. He is a registered architect and project manager with Slaggy Architect Incorporated in Kansas City, with over 30 years experience in the profession of architecture. Phil's design experience includes residential, commercial retail, restaurant, as well as collegiate and professional sports architecture. He is the current president of the Kansas City chapter for the National Organization of Minority Architects. For over 20 years, Phil has committed to aspiring and mentoring local youth to consider architecture and other design-related fields as career path to improve workforce and professional career diversity in Kansas City. So with that, we will welcome both of these gentlemen, and up first is Jeffrey Williams. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Amanda, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for spending some time to talk with us. We'll share some insights. We want to hear feedback from you as well as it relates to the whole concept of equity. It relates to Vision Zero and how we all get there and how we make sure that as we implement policies, processes, projects related to Vision Zero, we're doing it through an equitable framework. So Amanda's going to be kind of advanced slide to slide. So we're subtitled this session, Points to Ponder and a Call to Action. So I get the Points to Ponder portion of the presentation. It's a little bit of an overview of Kansas City, if people are not familiar with us. Talk about policies that we put in place in Kansas City that really build together to help achieve the goal of Vision Zero. But looking at those policies and the elements we have built with them that are looking to make sure we're making improvements in the most equitable way possible, ultimately, really, it's the idea about creating communities that are highly equitable. And by doing that, we know that the goals of Vision Zero will be accomplished. And Phil's got more of the call to action pieces and those things that you can do in your profession, in your civic engagement, in just spreading your awareness of the importance of not only meeting the goals of Vision Zero, but really looking at things with an equitable lens and framework. Thank you all for posting the responses to the question we put into the chat. Lots of you have identified topics and issues that I think you'll see covered between the presentation I'm going to provide, the one Phil is going to provide. So again, thanks. Please keep questions going all throughout the session and conversation. And then I know at the end, we'll both be available to respond to them. So with that, we'll kick off. Actually, maybe before you take, we'll kick off. That's back to that slide again. There's lots of things. So I think maybe talking a little bit about just kind of our backgrounds here. When first asked to do this session, we're like, well, you know, we're not transportation folks or planners, and this would make sense, but does this make sense? But really it does, because I think you'll find that through just some of our work in the planning professions department, the work that Phil does architecturally speaking, you know, it's taking all of these disciplines to come together to identify the appropriate approaches to achieve Vision Zero. So I just wanted to mention, if you see letters and things after our names, it really was to talk about the idea that, you know, really in everyone's professional background and experience, there are ways in which to create equitable environments that help accomplish the goals of Vision Zero. So we can go to the next slide. This part is always, I always want to make sure that people are oriented and they know about Kansas City and where I think most people are familiar with Kansas City, but if not, there we are, you know, right as the city, Kansas City, Missouri is right, the border of Kansas and Missouri. We are the center of a metro area, about 2.14 million people. You're seeing the stats there on the screen. We as a city are about 495,000. Our hope is that with completion of census, we'll get that figure to 500,000. And our area and our metro spans across 14 counties and 2 states. And there can be lots of policy implications with that really being a bi-state region. But for Kansas City, Missouri, I break it down by telling most folks that about 1 out of every 4 people who lives in metropolitan Kansas City lives in Kansas City, Missouri. And with that comes lots of responsibilities to innovate and to lead the way in a whole host of initiatives. A couple more slides, just quickly. We go next one, just about giving some statistics about who we are as a city there. And you're seeing information that is a good way to start understanding about lots of places, kind of our median household income being a bit lower than the national average, our home prices lower than national average, but certainly climbing. We have a poverty rate that is higher than the national average. And then you're seeing the racial breakdown of the city. But again, we'll get some new figures as we get results from 2020. But again, that's just a bit of a snapshot. So the next slide looks at just understanding a city for geography and footprint. And so the graphic at the bottom of the screen kind of shows that we are not a very densely developed city. We have pockets of density, but essentially we have residential and commercial corridors spread all throughout the city, a variety of different neighborhood styles. And so when you're looking at the density of ours, about 1,460 people per square mile, and let's even bump to Omaha, which is, well, about 2+ times that, and then Minneapolis, you kind of keep working there. It can be a challenge when you're a region and environment that that is that lightly populated, or is that dispersed. So we have some challenges as it relates just to making sure that we're able to take the folks that we have here and get them to move about the city and know that we have enough people and activity to be able to maintain that whole transportation infrastructure to help make sure that people are able to get about the city and really have the best quality of life they can in the city. Let's look at one more for some statistics and go there and more at a glance and kind of looking about just some statistics related to transportation infrastructure. And you're seeing there the amount of sidewalk miles we have and our total bike miles, and more breakdown and information about just those bike miles of miles where we have separations, major or minor separations, and our shared street facilities. But if you look at where we are from some statistics and moving away from bike infrastructure to auto infrastructure, the table at the lower left is showing that, you know, from 2000, of course, of 20 years, people are driving alone more, heading to places. Our carpooling numbers have dropped. Our public transit numbers have dropped. Our biking figures have gone up and down a little bit. You know, our walking figures, slight drops. And interestingly enough, the amount of people working from home has increased. And again, all these statistics are clearly derived prior to all of the change that is 2020. You know, we have a great bit of miles per person in the city. We're ranked 4th in the nation, and depending if you're a driver, that's a great thing. I know I've got colleagues here, Public Works, other places. Depending, these are highway miles, but other local miles, that's a lot of, you know, road to maintain and not a ton of folks to be able to help provide the revenue to pay the freight to maintain everything. But almost 90% of the folks in the city, we drive to work alone or you're carpooling, and the automobile is the dominant mode of transportation in the city. So it's not surprising that, again, over the course of the city's development, I'd say particularly over the last 70 years or so, the automobile moved to being the predominant mode of transportation. But I think everybody recognizes that there is a cost to owning a vehicle. And there's other types of costs beyond individual monetary, environmental, et cetera, to talk about road maintenance. Let's take a look at one more slide. And this is my last statistic slide, I promise. So now we're looking at our road miles again. We have lots of people commuting into this city, but that's a map of Kansas City, Missouri. And what you're seeing there is we're mapping the percentage of households within the area that don't have vehicles. So when you're looking at the blue, those are households that most likely, most of them have, maybe 5% don't have vehicles. As you get closer to the center of the city, you're seeing that our households without vehicles, that percentage is higher, in many cases up to 40%. Now, that is something certainly that works and acceptable if it's someone who, let's say, is not really looking to leave home, or is in an environment where they're able to walk out to goods and services or have access to mass transportation. Some of that, though, could be the idea that people in those areas just don't have the means to be able to afford a vehicle, and that vehicle could get them out to other employment centers, educational facilities, leisure environments. So the statistics on the right look at households without vehicles and how that breaks out from a racial and ethnic perspective. And then you're seeing households that don't have vehicles, the average incomes of those households in Kansas City, Missouri, you're seeing the significant difference, $50,000 difference in the average income with vehicles, with households with vehicles 2 or more. So in starting to look at transportation and starting to look at the predominant way we move around is with vehicles, but there is certainly a cost. There certainly is a household income distinction about vehicles, not vehicles. It really begins to make you wonder about everybody's focus on automobiles and really needing to look at alternate forms of transportation and making sure that we have a reasonable, equitable way to start diversifying some modes of transportation beyond automobile. Let's take a look at the next slide. And the next slide just is an image to show the different types, alternate modes of transportation in the city here. I think to surprise anybody, these are things that other cities have. Streetcar, it was a big battle for the city to get the streetcar going, but once established, it's been hugely successful, and it's a lifeline. The Prospect Max that's our express bus service. And so although more and more of those lines have been deployed, the recent Max line, Prospect Max, was deployed about a year or so ago. And the novelty there, that is deployed at free fare. So that was one of the initiatives of the mayor, was to look at providing free transit options. Because again, it's not only the barrier of maybe not be able to get to the bus, but when you get there, wanting to make sure that your ability to pay fare was not an issue. The streetcar is fare free, and its finances were structured to be that way. And then I thought it was important, trails, obviously, and then all this kind of, micro transit and small mobilities, bikes, scooters, huge all over the country. And I know there's a lot of debate about, is that, you can see the illustration of the bus there. They were having a bike rack on it. You'd be surprised, lots of systems that don't accept bikes on the bus, because that bike can be that first mile, that last mile connection for somebody during their transit trip. So it's also interesting as well. It's the idea about somebody being in a location from where they're at, being able to walk to transit, take transit, and be able to walk to their ultimate destination. And I think that's where we start to take a look at understanding moving around, understanding that clearly there is the need to make sure you're not only providing the mode of transportation, but you're providing a safe experience, people getting to that mode of transportation. So that's a bit of an overview from a transportation perspective. The next slide I want to show you just gives you a sense of all of the different policies and planning documents we have as a city. And lots of those plans, and you're seeing some of the illustrated, definitely have a direct relationship to transportation, the pedestrian experience, and our policies that have elements in them that help implement goals of Vision Zero. So things that wouldn't be surprising, if you probably picked out yourself a major street plan, we talk about that, a bike plan, walkability plans. But it's interesting to really think about how all these other plans support Vision Zero. I'll pick the master tree plan, for example, and understanding that, in an environment, and anybody who's been in Kansas City for a while knows that it gets really hot here. And understanding that, how can tree canopy potentially help in terms of shading walks back and forth. Looking at other plans, our overall housing plan, and then talking about the idea of transit-oriented development. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But again, sometimes it's really being very deliberate in understanding that you're encouraging development of certain types in locations because they are transit-rich and they can support or supported by multiple modes of transportation. Even things like a digital equity plan, talking about access compute, other types of things, that information is gateway to understanding how best to plan a transit trip, how to respond to changes in the system. So all these things really help work together to support the goals of Vision Zero. Let's take the next slide dives into a few of the policies that the city has put in place. The first I want to talk about was our transit-oriented development policy. It was approved in 2017. And why did we look to get this policy put in place? Well, really, it was an outgrowth of the concept of expanding the streetcar network. Streetcar started at 1.3 miles. There was a push at that time in 2016, 15-16, to look at expanding it additional 8 miles, and that was our phase 2. There was streetcar expansion going on now. One of those legs that was identified in this phase 2 expansion is happening down along Main Street. But the idea was we wanted to make sure that we had a policy, if we're going to put this infrastructure in, to make sure that the adjacent development is taking full advantage of that investment. Also looking at making sure we were being supportive of the regional transportation plan and smart moves. Also working to support the area around where the existing streetcar, the newly opened streetcar, was located within our downtown area, so greater downtown area plan. Ultimately, we wanted to make sure that we were being very specific and intentional about pursuing all forms of transit-oriented development as it relates to the city's overall comprehensive plan. Because I really look at at transit and mass transit and multiple transit, it really is getting the idea. And I think this is a first equity point, that I want people who live in Kansas City, Missouri to understand it's hugely important for their city to be equitable and diverse and more affordable, to have robust public transit, even if they never ever see themselves stepping on a bus. So even if they're one of those folks in the 2+ car households, I want them to have a realization and understanding that frequent, extensive, varied transit options builds a more equitable city, which is a better place for all of us. So when we talk about our framework for TOD, which is the next slide, it's the idea about what are we looking to emphasize. So emphasizing connectivity, emphasizing density, looking at diversity in a variety of different types, like I just mentioned, and then ultimately looking at design elements as well. So comfort and inviting. The idea is that when you have a resource such as transit, you want the most people to be able to access it. You want to make sure that it really is accessible to a broader group as possible. And you want it to be attractive. You want it to wind up being the anchor and the focus of your development pattern of the city. Kansas City, Missouri had the second largest streetcar network in the country before it started getting dismantled in the middle part of the 20th century. And so transit, being near transit, is an attraction point, and having some policies and framework to make sure that we're leveraging that transit investment is important. So that really is the framework. And then it was clear to tell people what TOD is and isn't. So it's connected, it's dense, it's diverse, and it's designed, and so it's not, isolated or sparse. The next slide lays that out a little bit more. And then we'll go take a look at one more slide, just talk about the typology. So we blew that ordinance. We have to recognize that in Kansas City, Missouri, we have a variety of different development patterns here. That's what makes the city great and unique. But this framework helps us be able to understand kind of what levels of density we're at, and then make sure that there are the appropriately responsive guidance as it relates to transit-oriented development. So in certain areas, it's just enough to say, hey, look, you have a bus location. It needs to be well lit. It needs to be safe. It needs to be clean. It should be at a location where somebody walking to it is going to be safe in doing so. And as you get more dense, you get a lot more detailed in terms of the guidance that we are providing in terms of what type of development should be adjacent to it. What types of mix of uses should be there. How should the transit station or stop be integrated into adjacent development? So that's the system that we've set up. So having the TOD policy is one of those pillars in terms of how we look at development. Let's take a look at the next slides, because we're going to shift a little bit and just talk about CPTED for a moment. So crime prevention through environmental design. And we wanted to make sure you kind of see the genesis of that. But it's the idea, I think people are familiar with, and it's an international movement about, how does architecture and planning in our facilities, how does it reduce or prevent crime? Interesting, also looking at it from a sense of kind of building community. So going all the way back with Jane Jacobs and her work in Manhattan, and battling Robert Moses in terms of trying to put a highway across Greenwich Village, right across Manhattan. And then the expanded upon is interesting. Oscar Newman, person did that. He actually looked at housing and housing development, particularly public housing development, and how it needed to be rethought and redesigned to be a bit more human-centered, getting people to living closer to the ground in certain cases, individual entry points, other kinds of things. His work was pretty pivotal in terms of looking at how cities, including Yonkers, New York, went about looking at housing desegregation and how restructuring their public housing developments, being done using the principles of CPTED. So there are 4 principles to look at CPTED, and those are things that we encourage folks to look at as we're reviewing development here. So the idea of natural surveillance is that, having streets and areas with good levels of pedestrian activity are great. Looking at the idea about how you can use elements, features, landscape to be able to control how people are accessing certain sites and locations. Kind of territorial reinforcement, and that sounds a little bit harsh, but I think sometimes it's understanding that there are public zones and there are kind of semi-public zones and private zones. Ultimately, I think the management and maintenance end of this, and this goes with any investment you're making, is that the higher level of maintenance, the better management, all leads to safer environments. And then I think when we want to talk about equity across these things, just the thing that has to be assured is that that maintenance and that management happens well and consistently across the entirety of the system, and that does not vary based upon any socioeconomics or any demographics of the community. So I'll go to the next slide and I'll talk a little faster because I want to make sure I don't drop into Phil's time. So ultimately, complete streets, and I'm sure the group is familiar here, but looking at safe, convenient, comfortable travel and plan that for all types of users, regardless of mode of transportation. So the next slides just talk about how we are embedding and looking at complete streets here, besides in addition to ordinance that we adopted after TOD ordinance about complete streets, but modifications to our major street plan. So to make sure we have some alternate street sections to accommodate alternative modes of transportation. Boulevard and parkway standards here. We are still building that system out 130 years later. So we're still living the city beautiful, if you will. And one of the elements there was putting some standards in about boulevards and parkways and development along them. So there you're starting to see some of the concepts of where do buildings get located? How do we buffer parking off of the roadways? How do we prioritize landscaping along there? Design criteria, being very specific about transparency, visibility, and also making sure we have standards that are applicable to a variety of different building types. The next slide just shows some of the different projects that we've been working on through support of through the Planning Sustainable Places, Creating Sustainable Places program supported through grants from MARC. So you're seeing images of a variety of different projects where we had funds to be able to study and understand movement along corridors, obviously not only vehicular movement, but pedestrian movements, and then supporting a variety and series of design standards. So Independence Avenue is one of 3 corridors where we have design overlays. Troost Avenue being another one, Main Street being another one, where we do start to talk about setbacks and materials and building features. And this is transparency. This is blamed to CPTED, but it's also really making sure we have clear, well-marked pedestrian paths as well. So at the end of the day, it's all of these elements coming together to really form that complete street, that safe environment, that's supportive of a variety of different types of transportation and movement throughout the city. And through these policies, we want all these elements to come together. The piece to this, though, is how do you do that in an equitable way? And how do you get a sense of what community is thinking about this? 2 more slides, maybe 3. The next one is about just a commercial. We're right now in the process of updating the city's comprehensive plan. So please, when you get a chance, have the presentation, go to playbook.kcmo.gov. And it's called the KC Spirit Playbook. And we are starting on a path. We'll probably have another 2 years on this path to put together the comprehensive plan. But please know that Vision Zero and all the policies we talked about will be big elements of this plan. But through this plan, we're really trying to mesh together some of the different topics that I just talked about, some of what we're calling lenses. And certainly equity is one of those lenses in terms of, in addition to sustainability and community building and housing affordability. That's kind of how we will judge the recommendation we come up with. And the third piece to that is really about context, doing some of those things we did in our transit-oriented development plan to really show people this is the context in which you're working, and here are some best practices. ultimately, we really want to look at, again, and that's what we're doing, bring our policies, initiatives together, looking at the goals, these goals of Vision Zero. Ultimately, we will get there because we're really looking for equitable development, creating livable, vibrant, and safe communities accessible to all. So my last slide is the points to ponder. I will, in full deference, this is one of the things I remember grew up with reading the Reader's Digest about. I want people to think about. So let's think about these equity points and places as it relates to these policies. Fair flexibility. So the idea of free transit, or if it's paid transit or tier transit system, how do we look at that? Supporting mixes of use, making sure that we have environments where people, if transportation going to and fro is a challenge, are we supporting a variety of use at certain locations? Housing at all levels of affordability is huge. That's one of the pillars of the city's housing plan. What about some of those other transit systems or investments or share opportunities that provide access at lower price points for people to be able to complete their trek vehicle free? Complete streets, and somebody mentioned chat, mobility for all. So it's all levels of ability, all access to any type of vehicle. Are we starting to score and index what investments we're making to be able to prioritize our capital projects funding? Somebody put that directly in the chat. I saw that. We have to start looking at prioritizing things and looking at things through the lens of equity when we're making funding decisions. And then the CPTED pieces, I think, are, again, those are more the standard kind of architectural elements of this, but the idea about having safe environment, and somebody put in the chat an environment, I think it was a safe environment everywhere, for people to be able to get to the places they need to get to. So those are elements incorporated within those policies that speak to the equity issue. But I'm going to turn things over to Phil, and I think Phil is going to get to more of those kind of call to actions and things that we can all do to make sure as we build out our transportation systems, it's being done in an equitable way. Phil?
Phil, you've been muted, so you just got to unmute yourself and you're good to go. Nope, still muted.
All right, can everybody hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
There we go. My apologies. I want to thank Mark for inviting me to this presentation, myself and Jeffrey. I thought Jeffrey did a great job to talk about his title, the things that he does for the city of Kansas City, Missouri. And a lot of what he discussed, particularly some of the statistical information he showed us, will help lend credence to a few of the things I'd like to bring about in my presentation. My presentation will be less than 15 minutes, so hopefully I can get through all this and have time for questions and answers. Call to action, just as Jeffrey said, is my portion of the presentation, where we talk about a case for equity, which is the subject of this presentation. And that, in terms of equity, the question is about what should equity look like? Understanding equity and what to do about it is what we're trying to achieve here. As an architect, I've been an architect for about 33 years now. And as a designer, that's a constant challenge that we should be thinking of. When I started out as an architect, equity is something, it was something as a young architect that I wasn't thinking of. As I've become a little older, a little bit more wiser, a little bit more wisdom in my profession, it's something I seek to become more aware of and get more educated in. Also, as an architect, I'm also chapter president of an organization that Amanda was telling you about, National Organization of Minority Architects, the Kansas City chapter. We were established nearly 2 years ago. We've been chartered for about 13 months now. And as an organization, we're trying to develop the equation that equals equity in every aspect of design that we touch. And the interesting part of our organization is that we're not just architects, as the title seems to bring. We're actually anybody within the design profession, people including myself, Jeffrey, general contractors, landscape architects, civil, structural MEP engineers, interior designers, and even artists. If doctors and lawyers wanted to be a part of our organization, they could be a part of that dialect and that conversation. And we open that. So in our case for equity, I'm going to go to the next slide. When I was brought about to speak on this, I didn't know who Vision Zero was. Maybe some of you people who are watching this presentation may not know exactly what Vision Zero is or what they're about. So I thought it would be important to talk a little bit about what they are about. Now that I know, Vision Zero is a strategy to eliminate all traffic fatalities and severe injuries while increasing safe, healthy, equitable mobility for all. First implemented in Sweden in the 1990s, Vision Zero has proved successful across Europe and is now gaining momentum in major American cities. This is great. To the next slide talks a little bit about what their mission is and how they plan to do this. Once a community has committed to Vision Zero, it should create an action plan to clearly lay out action steps, timelines, and priorities, and include broader community and stakeholder input. That is important. And as an architect, as a designer, as anybody who is in my profession or any design profession in Kansas City or any city for that matter, I think our missions very much align with Vision Zero. Going to the next slide. And I think I can catch all this. I mean, Vision Zero, their policy aligns very much with not just mine, but anybody in the design profession. So the vision alignment in design, as Vision Zero strives to protect life from the daily challenges of travel and physical accessibility, the vision of the profession of design, which is what I'm in, is to improve and unify life in the built environment for all. So the built environment is inclusive of not just only pedestrian travel or traffic that we talk about in terms of how we devise better safety measures to try to prevent death, but we're trying to prevent death and a better quality of life through use of the automobile pedestrian traffic. We take into account air traffic. As designers, we're forced to look at rail traffic, such as light rail. The success of that, as Jeffrey has talked about it within our city. We also look at the aspects of water travel. And for me, particularly as an architect, I'm forced to look at all the life safety criteria and initiatives that we need to draw upon for buildings, whether they be residential or non-residential, which many of us call either commercial or retail or industrial. And we also pay attention to events that are either indoor or outdoor. And that's important because in my line of work, when you have venues such as football stadiums, and I've done a number of football stadiums in my career, the factor of life safety becomes different than a person walking out of their house, because if there's a disaster or something that's happening within that venue, those people are required to exit that facility or that venue as fast as they can, as safely as they can, without death. And I have experienced a life and death on that factor in itself. There is also another key point that sometimes is overlooked. I even overlooked it and meant to add it to this presentation, and that's wayfinding. Wayfinding, imagine this. So when you drive from downtown in Kansas City, Missouri, and have to go to the international airport or any international airport in any major city, you've got signs you have to follow. When you get to that airport, those signs are telling you how to get to that terminal. They're telling you where to go park. And some of the signs are telling you not where to park if you don't want a ticket. So
Phil, I think you maybe froze. Oh, I think you're back with
Okay.
us. You're good.
Okay, I was told I froze a little bit, but I just wanted to stress that wayfinding oftentimes is an overlooked aspect of design and should be very much included in these bullet points that you see here. We'll go to the next slide. Does equity exist? So that's the big $64,000 question. Is there currently equity and fairness to assess resources and opportunities necessary for all of us to thrive and survive? It depends on who you ask. When you ask me as an architect here in the city of Kansas City, Missouri, I don't think equity exists in everything. And I mean just in a holistic moment. Equity is, you look at equity in terms of black and white, in terms of race, in terms of religion, in terms of every aspect, in terms of politics, and even the election we just had last night. Those questions are rhetorical questions, but are they questions to answer in terms of yes or no. Is there equity in everything? And I say that there isn't. In design, it's the same question. As an architect, when it comes to achieving equity in design, I as a designer have to look at myself and wonder if I'm self-aware of all the issues, or if I'm socially aware of all the issues before I enter upon design of something, before I understand the context of what needs to be addressed in that design, and or even perhaps have empathy for that design. These are the things as a designer I'm forced to ask myself, and not make it about me. Make the design about those who are going to be a part of the design. It's important that when we design, that we're designing for everyone, whether that's everyone that is Black or white, or from a standpoint of transgender versus heterosexual, any of these issues. These are issues that as designers we're being asked to partake on and to be very sensitive to. And so in order to have equity, I feel that there are 4 points we need to talk on in order to arrive to that. And that's communication, transparency, education, and collaboration. Going to the next slide, I'll talk about for equality to happen, communication is key. It's our number 1 point. One of the things when it comes to communicating, we're asked to listen. Sometimes people, including myself, do more talking than listening. And I'm training myself to do more listening to people's problems and issues rather than just spout off myself and think that what I have to say is more important. When it comes to listening, we have to value everybody's opinions and statements as if theirs are just as important, if not more important, than what you have to bring to the table. Understanding the problem, that's part of the communication process. Sometimes when it comes to better neighborhoods or trying to get from point A to point B, or if we're talking about sidewalks, do we actually have sidewalks that are accessible to certain neighborhoods that allow us to get to other neighborhoods that are perhaps a mile away? Are we listening to those problems? Are we listening to the infrastructure problems that either exist or don't exist? These are the things that we're trying to do to understand problems on why there are certain issues or problems that are more problematic in a certain neighborhood or a certain district of a city versus others. That's part of understanding the problem. Getting to the truth. When it comes to truth, sometimes we don't know how to distinguish the truth from fiction. Case in point, the political climate that we have today, being Democrat or Republican, or being, just Catholic versus Protestant. We can agree on certain things that we learn or educate ourselves about as we communicate to one another about our issues, but are we understanding enough to the point that we can all be on the same page as to what is being said? So going to the next slide. Transparency. It's about being honest. When we're all at the table to try to understand an issue that needs to get past a design sense in terms of, do we have an agreement that there's a potential problem here in this neighborhood that has to be fixed in order to be maintained in other districts of our city? It's talking comfortably about uncomfortable issues that people may not want to address because it may be sensitive or insensitive to them or insensitive to others. It's just an honest conversation about the issues that create problems, whether it be in our neighborhoods, whether it be in human race, or just anything. Design is just one aspect of what that touches equity and equality. And so can we prove inequality? Sure, we can do that. Jeffrey earlier posed a bunch of statistics that were very helpful, and visually they were very appealing to get a good sense or an understanding of why there are issues in certain areas and not very bad issues in others. And you can use that statistical information as truth. That's the proof that you use to provide your statement, your argument to those you go to say, yes, there's equity here or there is not. And who's affected? Understanding who's affected by those demographics, by those statistics. Jeffrey had talked about, you remember the areas in blue that basically showed those neighborhoods that did not have transportation or cars. It's understanding that's a group that's affected. So how do we want to improve getting more transportation to those areas? Those are the kinds of questions we're trying to answer. Those are addressing those areas or those people who are affected. Next slide. Education. Education, this is perhaps the most important part of this presentation. Knowledge is power. the sooner you know, you're able to arm yourself with an education about the issues, why there's problems here, why there's not problems here, why does the city of Leawood have a established deal with beautifying this part of the street and not streets in other neighborhoods. It's getting to understand the lay of the land. It's understanding history. There's always history. There's always history that falls way back. And the better you know about history, the better you're able to paint a better future, a better scenario for the future that you're fighting for. Identifying the barriers that need to be removed. That's a part of the education process. If you don't know where you're going, if you don't know from past history in terms of what was affected prior, you're not going to know where you're going to land in the future. It's important to understand barriers, what impacts people and why do they impact it, and why are there barriers to begin? Why were the barriers there to begin with? Remove complacency. You know, if we all had the attitude that, you know, it's not my problem. When George Floyd was killed, you know, the whole issue of inequity and racism, that's not my problem. I don't need to deal with that. Well, that is the problem. Complacency, the idea that it affects others but doesn't affect me. Well, it should affect all of us. In equity in design, equity in life, equity in everything should be a thoughtful piece for all of us, not just for a certain group of people or for those who have more concern about it than others. Once we all learn to own it, then I think we start to begin to talk about how we can resolve the issues that exist today. Rules of law. Jeffrey talked about all the policies that he has helped to develop. Well, Jeffrey's great at providing the framework and all the rules that people like me as designers have to follow. If we pay attention to those protocols and those things that Jeffrey and his departments identify, this helps us better come to the solution on what has to be resolved and how it gets resolved. And then you're smarter than you think. A lot of us think we don't have the smarts to deal with something of this nature when it comes to tackling problems of issue on equity or diversity and inclusion. But we are when we get educated. And it becomes more easy when you start to understand all the issues, negative and positive. To the next slide, I'm almost done. Collaboration. So this is how we resolve it all, y'all. This is where the rubber meets the road. Challenge your peers on these issues. Once you get educated about the issues and have enough to have a leg to stand on in terms of being able to fight for what you're trying to design or for whatever the cause is, challenge your peers, get them into it as well. They can back you up and some of them won't, but you can get them on your side. Community engagement. It's important that as a designer, I go out and talk to the community or those stakeholders who are involved with who I'm designing for. If I can understand their issues, relate to those issues right away, it helps make me a better designer in terms of answering the very questions they need answered. Align with other organizations. As a NOMA organization, I align with all these organizations that you see on this slide right here. City of Kansas City, Missouri, as a matter of fact, is an organization I have to learn to align with. Sometimes I don't always agree, but I do agree with them for the most part in order to make our environment, our built environment better. KCDC, they're the Kansas City Design Center. We're currently working with them to try to provide a better environment in certain areas of the city, the entire city. AIA Kansas City, American Institute of Architects. We are locked in arms with them. We have the same mission. We have the same ideals about how do we address equity and inclusion within our profession. And develop an action plan. Develop an action plan that's bulletproof. Something that you can use, something that you put on paper. It could be a presentation like I'm doing right now to talk to stakeholders as well as talk to our city government. I can use that presentation and talk to the city government about why we think this action is necessary. And then the last slide. Equity should look like we're all in this together. So in closing, I'd like to think that the equation that equals zero is an equation that says no more equality. That's a big answer to have to try to it's a big problem to try to find an answer to. But my hope is that after our presentation today, that we at least start a conversation that makes you think about why it's necessary to think about equity. And why it's necessary is because it is everybody. Some of us don't think that it is, but it should involve all of us. That's what equity, I feel, should look like. All of us working together. Thank you for your time, and I hope that this portion of the presentation on the call to action made sense. And if it doesn't, please give a contact to myself and to Jeffrey, and I believe Amanda is going to show you what that information is as you all are up for questions now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Phil and Jeffrey, for your fantastic and informative presentation. I know I found one question in the chat that I'll ask, but I'll encourage anybody, if you have questions, if you want to type them in the chat, go ahead and do that, or feel free to unmute yourselves as we go forward. So we have this question that says, is there a measurement tool that provides us with a metric on community attitudes and capacity to support such initiatives and policies?
Ooh, that is a good question. I think Jeffrey's can swing the bat on that.
Oh, thank you for pitching that to me, Phil. No, one of the conversations I think as it looks to any topic on equity, we're talking about this, is that folks are sometimes looking for that precise tool in terms of how to measure where we are at from that perspective. And I always say to people, there is not one tool. I think there are frameworks. I think the framework that Phil laid out was excellent in the idea about engaging people that you are looking to work with and support, and being honest in that engagement and authentic and hearing things you don't necessarily want to hear. I think letting people have time to express what their issues are. Now, a way to pivot from that and people expressing their issues, I think then developing the work plan that Phil talked about. And then, for us, we like the concepts of working with the community group that we are helping to plan with. We kind of mutually come up with some measures or some metrics. So kind of almost a bit like today's presentation. Sometimes, one person comes in with some very quantifiable information. Someone else comes with, more of those kind of qualifiable kind of, kind of maybe even a bit more human-centered, those kind of metrics as well. So real kind of, I think it's a blend. I think that's a methodology. I can't say it's one particular check sheet. I can say, though, that the way to ensure authenticity as you're doing any project is to make sure, I think as Phil said, you look at equity issues across the entirety of the process, from building the team to work with community, to all of your community engagement levels, to the ultimate policies you put in place, or ultimately the ultimate things that you build, and ultimately knowing that you want to hear from a wide variety of stakeholders in terms of feedback, either on what you built or the policies you're working under. So a long way of saying no, there's no one quick spreadsheet or checklist, if you will.
There you go. I'd like to add just a tidbit to what Jeffrey said, and that is this, and I hope you don't take it as more harsh, but as a measuring tool, I use my eyes and my ears to see the different attractions from one aspect of a neighborhood or a community to the other. So if I go to the northeast quadrant of Kansas City, Missouri, and see dilapidated neighborhoods versus going to Leawood, Kansas, where I currently have some projects in construction, that's a visual measuring stick in terms of equality and imbalances. So I'm just painting a visual picture of how I get a sense of where things need to be worked on in our community versus where things don't have to be worked on as much. Maybe that's more of a blunt assessment, and certainly didn't mean it that way. But to me, our senses, our eyes and our ears are our closest ally in terms of telling us what the visual aspects or measuring tools are about what's balanced and what's not, what needs fixing and what doesn't need fixing in our community. And I hope that's not blunt with a bat, but I think those are things that as human beings, we should be paying attention to, what we see around us. And that is part of the issues of the built environment that should force us to pay attention to it. Thank you.
Phil, can I pick up that bat? We'll keep the bat thing going. And maybe this sounds blunt as well, because we all implement plans. It's going beyond many times the spirit of the check boxes. I provided this particular type of facility. It is about how it looks. it is about how it's placed. I will tell you that if I go to an environment and they said this is a transit-friendly environment, I'm curious where the transit is placed. If the transit hub is
Yes.
placed at the edge of the environment, next to the dumpster, by the highway, I'm not really sure that is with the intent of looking at public transportation and looking at a way equitable and integrating it with the other aspects of this development. I have a really hard time with. That's the visual piece. And that's the piece that we all intuitively have that Phil talks about. You know, what does this look like to you? What does this say? Yes, it does matter how things are kept and that there be consistency in that, because that speaks to it as well. You don't need to be a practitioner or an expert to understand when something is not prioritized because it's shoved in a corner. I mean, so those are very basic things that sometimes people have to be confronted with. You know, those folks in the project review and design realm, please, by all means, push back on that kind of stuff. That's just not, that's not quite good enough. And it's consistent. And I guess I'll talk about age, you know, doing this for 20, 30 years, you know, there's been a huge thought even about the whole idea of public transit, how it's kind of like only certain people ride public transit, or it doesn't even, so, you know, there's an evolution, but the only way the evolution happens is that there's somebody who just keep over and over and over and over again, reinforcing that what needs to be done in a very human-centered way. So I'll totally drop the bat at that point.
It's a great analogy. I don't know why we don't keep it going. Yeah, I'd like to open the floor to any other questions.
Well, I have one. This is Alex with Mid-America Regional Council, and this is a tough question considering we only have three minutes remaining. But for those kind of neighborhoods that have been kind of historically disenfranchised, disinvested in, oftentimes minority neighborhoods, how can we be more engaged with those communities? And I'm thinking of this in terms of, I work at MARC, I have worked at a city, I'm thinking of it in terms of that, but we need to earn their respect and their, their trust, I think. And that's a difficult question, again, with only 3 minutes left, but I mean, I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on the matter.
Alex, I'd like to try to take a stab at answering that if I could. So as president of an organization, okay, I think there's a connect. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So very quickly, one of NOMA's missions, our chapter in Kansas City, is to reach out to underprivileged kids about the education of my profession as well as other design professions. And the reason for that is because as an architect, not a Black architect, but an architect who happens to be Black, I'm less than 1% of an African-American architect, licensed architect in my profession nationwide. And the only way I'm going to see more people who look like me, or more females, or more people of color, or more transgender in my profession, is to reach out to those kids who live in that neighborhood. Getting to the chase very quickly, it's about the educational process of being able to educate those who are in the underprivileged neighborhoods, to let them know that they too can be like me or anybody else, to try to educate themselves to the point where they can do what I'm doing. And it's those areas where there seems to be despair and the ability to think that there isn't a chance that I can go into something of a job of my profession. I struggle with an education, but I cared enough that I wanted to be doing what I am doing. And my hope is that with my face, I can reach out to neighborhoods such as that to let them know that if you work hard at it and go through the educational process of betterment and doing things that allow you to get out of the neighborhood, to allow you to contribute to not only to your families, but to others, and to be able to contribute to society, to make our world more equal so that we can balance out all neighborhoods to be the same and not lesser or lower or higher or whatever, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's important to go to those neighborhoods and to talk about these issues, to try to take inequality and erase it. I know that time is running out, and I don't know that I explained that very well, but I hope part of that answer made some kind of sense
Phil, can I
without
also,
offending anybody.
I know we're over time, but let me add in a thought. I think a lot of this really, is in terms of engaging any community is understanding the idea of power and the power dynamic. First of all, when you're dealing with any community, you need to walk in knowing they are the experts. I don't care how many classes you've taken, I don't care, they're the experts. And setting up processes that demonstrate and let people know they have the power. So lots of things in a session a while ago that was involving groups like, working yourself out of the room. So when you're engaged with the community, the community may have come to you and said, we need help with something. And one of the best outcomes I've seen of processes is that through that process and time, we told community, you are aware, you're supportive. Phil said, you know more than you think. And as we kept engaging, we kept being very deliberate about moving ourselves out of that room and out of that space, not to abandon anybody, but to empower community. That's the best thing we can do. We all can't, there's limitations everywhere. Time, money, talent. Yes, we need to diversify the talent pool. Yes, it is always helpful to have people who are helping communities with projects be represented or look like them. But community looks like itself. And if we empower community and really empower them by having them run process, control process, set measures, set expectations, that really is one of the best ways to be able to engage communities and diverse communities. It's not being careful, not just to dump the problem off on somebody. Hey, yeah, this is the problem. Gotta go. Bye. It's really working to build that skill and that technique. And then at that point, it is truly community driven and community led and ultimately long-term community supported.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate a virtual round of applause. I'm sure. Thank you so much. Chris Feeney, I want to let you know that I did see your question, and I'll make sure it gets to Phil and Jeffrey to get a response for you. So thank you everyone for participating in this. Our next session is tomorrow at 1 p.m. It's the operationalizing Vision Zero case studies from Austin, Texas and Boulder, Colorado. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. And thank you again to our wonderful speakers, Jeffrey and Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity.